From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
The Senate has the votes to clear a key procedural hurdle in passing legislation to avert a government shutdown come midnight after an abrupt turnaround from Democratic leadership. Bill Hoagland of the Bipartisan Policy Center joins us with reaction.
President Trump vowing to keep the FBI in D.C. and to expel rogue actors, as he calls them, from the government in his speech at the Department of Justice that just ended. As his tariff threats drag on consumer sentiment and boost inflation expectations. We'll have much more ahead with economist Diane Swonk of KPMG.
And former Ambassador James Jeffrey also joins this hour as Trump says the U.S. had good and productive discussions with Russian President Vladimir Putin amid the push for a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. Thank you for being with us on this Friday evening with just 7 hours to go until the government lights potentially turn off, at least metaphorically speaking. And it does seem that after much confusion, Senate Democrats will have provided the necessary votes to get over a key hurdle. And we want to get the latest now with Bloomberg's Washington correspondent, Tyler Kendall. So, Tyler, clearly this is hard fought, but it does seem things are on track.
Yeah, hey, Kelly. The White House on a cusp of a political win as the Senate appears poised to pass this crucial vote, this crucial test that needed to get done in order to fast-track this government spending bill. It comes after Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer yesterday reversed course, brought back his threat that he was going to make Republicans negotiate or risk going into a potential partial government shutdown. But it comes as he faces his own blowback from within his own party. One person applauding him, though, was President Trump, who had this to say earlier.
I have great respect, by the way, for what Schumer did today. He went out and he said that we're going to have to vote with the Republicans because it's the right thing to do. I couldn't believe what I heard. But, you know, I think he's going to get some credit for it. I think. Let's see what happens tonight with the big vote.
Now, here's a live look at the Senate where the cloture vote is underway. This ends debate on the bill that would fund the government until September 30th, essentially fast-tracking the process. This is considered to be a key hurdle that needs to get done. It comes, though, after earlier today, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying that the, quote, false choice that some in her party are buying instead of fighting is unacceptable. I spoke to one senior aide in Schumer's office who said this really feels like a lose-lose situation for Democrats. On one hand, they want to negotiate those firmer spending guardrails to counter this White House. But on the other, they knew that they could be blamed by the White House if a shutdown did happen. Joe and Kaylee, you said it before, the deadline 12:01 Eastern Saturday morning for a potential partial government shutdown. But it comes amid a lot of economic uncertainty, market volatility, and already heightened concerns among federal workers.
Well, Tyler, we're celebrating the fact here that the government apparently won't shut down tonight, which is a far cry from some of the more ambitious goals that this administration and this Republican-led Congress have. Is it next now on to reconciliation? What's the administration telegraphing? Now that we got through this part, we didn't shut down, but there's a lot of work left when it comes to Trump tax cuts, when it comes to the debt ceiling, and a lot more.
Exactly, Joe. When we found out that President Trump was pushing for the September 30th date, that timeline signaled to us that Washington understands it's going to take a few months to get through his fiscal agenda. And the fiscal agenda is really a key part of this for this White House. Continuously, we have heard President Trump and his senior administration officials, when they are talking about this short-term adjustment period, they are saying that that is going to be in exchange for long-term growth. And that is really alluding to getting through his tax cuts. But that is by no means a done deal either. There is a lot of negotiations that still need to be done.
All right, Tyler, thank you so much. Live from the White House, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall on this Friday evening. As we keep our eyes on the House and the Senate, we have a lot more on the impact of this vote and what might be next with Bill Hoagland joining us now at the desk, Senior Vice President at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Bill, it's great to have you back and good to see you.
Good to be here, Joe.
I don't know your thoughts on this. You must be smirking a little bit that we're celebrating the fact that we didn't shut down the government here, even though we're not quite done with the process. What do you make of this last-minute change of heart by Chuck Schumer?
He had a Hobson's choice. It was damned he do, damned he didn't. He didn't have really a choice here. And the shutdown doesn't benefit anybody. And at this particular stage, we're 5 months in or 6 months into the fiscal year. Quite frankly, we should be working on the fiscal year that's coming up in October in 6 months. That's where we should be right now. So he didn't have a good choice. As I understand, there's going to be another vote tonight. Maybe it's going to be by unanimous consent. That's going to fix something, set it out, and that's the D.C. Provision that was in the CR that caused a lot of consternation here in the Capitol. And so that may have helped him a little bit along in getting the votes that he needed here. But as I say, he didn't really have a good choice here.
Well, if it was a difficult choice, it also means that it's a choice that not everyone agreed with. If this is a Democratic Party that is now perhaps more fractured than it already was, what are the implications for going forward as they try to fight battles on other legislation that a Republican-controlled Congress?
Well, as was mentioned in your lead-in here, there's still a lot to be done here, and that relates to the bigger picture, and that is the adoption of a budget blueprint for the fiscal year that we're in, fiscal year 25, that has the tax cuts, has the additional savings that they're trying to achieve. There are a long ways between where those two are right now, the Senate and the House, way different. And in order to get to the tax bill that the president wants, in order to get to the savings, they're going to have to pass a budget resolution conference agreement. They're nowhere near that. So that is going to take some time. And there's where some leverage exists with the Democrats in terms of the provisions that are going to be in that reconciliation bill. Now, admittedly, if you get to actually get a budget resolution conference agreement with a reconciliation instructions agreed to, which will be difficult, they do avoid the 60-vote hurdle at that particular point. But we've still got a long way to go. And like I say, right now, we still should be looking also about what we just passed here for fiscal year 25. We should be also looking at what we're going to do about appropriations that will be up against another shutdown come here at the end of September. God,
what a thought. As we show a live view of the Senate chamber right now on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube, these are the procedural votes that will lead, of course, to the big one here when it comes to the CR. It does seem like it's going to pass, Bill. But what you're talking about, the friction that's coming, is all about Republicans, right? Will Democrats even play into the reconciliation process? And can this Republican majority get to see eye to eye on the Trump agenda?
I think you're going to find that there's going to be some difficulty even within the Republican
That's the
Party.
problem, isn't it?
Well, it'll be on some of those spending items, particularly as it relates to one of the big saving items that at least the House budget indicated was in the Medicaid program. There are going to be a lot of Republicans who are going to have some real difficulty with finding $880 billion in the Medicaid program. So it's not, yes, there's going to be some difficulty there for the Democrats, but there's going to be a lot of difficulty for even some Republicans. And the other issue there is as it relates to the deficit. Quite frankly, as it stands right now with doing a tax cut that they want to do in this reconciliation bill, we're not going to be reducing debt and deficit in this country. Quite frankly, we'll be adding to it. There are those fiscal hawks still up there that think we ought to be doing something about the debt and deficit. And just simply cutting taxes and adding to that deficit is going to cause them some problems.
Endangered species these days.
Yeah. Well, and I'm very glad, Bill, that you raised Medicaid, because today Mehmet Oz faced his Senate Finance confirmation hearing as he has, of course, been nominated to head the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And this was his exchange with Democratic Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon.
Since you cherish Medicaid, will you agree to oppose cuts in the Medicaid program?
I cherish Medicaid, and I've worked within the Medicaid environment quite extensively, as I highlighted, practicing at Columbia University.
That's not the question, Doctor. The question is, will you oppose cuts to this program you say you cherish? Time's short.
I want to make sure that the patients today and in the future have resources to protect them if they get ill.
Let the record show that I asked a witness who said he cherishes this program, will you agree to oppose cuts? And he would not answer a yes or no question.
Indeed, that was not a direct answer, but as you just alluded to, it is a hard one for many politicians to answer. This is a potentially politically damaging issue if you come down on the wrong side of it in the view of the people voting for you. So if Medicaid can't realistically be touched, at least to the extent that they're planning, what do you cut instead?
Well, you look at the SNAP program. If you're taking Social Security off the table, you're taking Medicare off the table. I don't think you should anticipate that Medicaid is completely off the table. We're talking about cuts in spending. You hear the president and you hear the DOJ people talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, nobody's for waste, fraud, and abuse in any of these programs. How much is in there? The GAO last week indicated that maybe there was $31 billion in overpayments in the program. That's not fraud. It's just management errors and putting together. So there is something. And also they're talking about work requirements. Are those cuts? I don't know. So you'll see some movement around the area there. But reductions in the reimbursement rates, those are off the table. There's no way I can see the getting a reconciliation bill that it includes $880 billion at this stage.
Bill, you mentioned the cuts to the D.C. budget. When we consider the federal city, this is something that we've aired out a bit on the program. Come to find out that this was not some sort of punitive action by Republicans against the dreaded District of Columbia, that it was largely chalked up to an error to cut $1 billion out of the budget here and maybe prompt a recession. Are they going to get around this tonight?
Yeah, I believe they'll get around it. I think that was Mr. Schumer made a comment before they went to that vote that he has indicated that they would have a bipartisan agreement on a fix to that. They'll be sitting down separately from the CR, so they don't have to send the CR back to the House. Now, the question will be when the House comes back on the 25th, will they take that up and pass it? But I think they will. I think what this highlights is the difficulty of doing this, managing government this way through continuing resolutions. We wouldn't be in this situation if we do the 12 individual appropriation bills. A CR does not have a report to go, so this provides a lot of flexibility for the administration to implement what's in this CR, as opposed to if you pass an individual appropriation bill, you're going to have report language that gives a lot more guidance and a lot more say for the legislative branch over how the money is going to be allocated, even with the numbers that they're providing. So all this points up to the difficulty of operating under a continuing resolution, which unfortunately we've had a lot over the many years that I've been here.
No doubt.
Well, all of it, of course, factoring into the fiscal responsibility equation for the U.S. If it was this hard to just, and it's not necessarily a done deal yet, though it does look like we're on track here, Bill. If it's this hard to just keep the government funded, even through continuing resolution, how hard is it going to be to lift the debt ceiling in a few months?
Well, of course, if the debt limit is put in that reconciliation bill, they could avoid the 60-vote hurdle. It's going to be tough. And in fact, I would argue that if they do a debt limit bill freestanding, that's where leverage does occur for the Democratic Party going forward. Remember, the reason we have these caps right now for the current fiscal year comes out of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 23, which set these caps. This is the last one. We're finished. We're going to have to negotiate again that debt limit along with caps for the upcoming fiscal year. And remind you, everybody knows this, I guess, but I just have to keep reminding people, we're talking about $1.8 trillion, which is only about 30% of, it's all that other portion of that's 75% of the rest of the budget. That's where the tough stuff lies. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps or SNAP benefits, all those, that's where the real difficulty gets to when it comes to finding consensus.
All right, Bill Hoagland, thank you as always for joining us, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And coming up, U.S. consumer sentiment falls to a more than 2-year low as inflation expectations jump. We'll take a look at how tariffs are impacting the data with Diane Swonk, Chief Economist at KPMG, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And this isn't some sort of partisan expression. We saw a 10% deterioration in expectations for Republicans alone. I think people across the board, across demographic groups, really are quite worried about the future.
That was Joanne Su, Director of Surveys of Consumers at the University of Michigan, with Bloomberg's Michael McKee earlier today, as data showed sentiment fell to a more than 2-year low, while long-term inflation expectations jumped by the most since 1993. Joining us now for more is Diane Swonk, Chief Economist at KPMG. Diane, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. When we look at the data today, knowing that the Fed has suggested, and we're going to hear from them next week, that they are waiting to see how policy plays out, does this not suggest that the consumer isn't waiting to see that already? It's changing, at the very least, sentiment, if not behavior outright?
Well, that's what we're worried about. There's some aspect of this that's just an IQ test. I mean, if you've been watching the news and you're not worried about tariffs and inflation, then I don't know where you've been. And on the other side of it, we've seen very high-profile layoffs, whether it be the federal government or larger firms are also doing layoffs as well. And so it's not surprising to see some of this, but the extent to which we've seen it consistently deteriorate over 3 months' time, very worrisome. And we know that uncertainty was mentioned a lot as well. Now, measurements globally of uncertainty have already lapsed the pandemic, which is stunning. That is its own tax on the economy. I've likened it to, a broken stoplight. When there's a broken stoplight at a busy intersection, traffic comes to a halt, traffic backs up, and everybody very cautiously tries to go through, or some people do a U-turn and opt out entirely. That's the kind of thing we're looking closely at. Of course, we'll get the retail sales number on Monday, and I think that there's a lot of people looking for some increase in rebound from January. I'm not sure it's going to be as strong as they think. The early credit card data is not great, and there's a lot of indicators to suggest that actually there was some hunkering down that consumers are beginning to do in their behaviors, and it's a very stagflationary kind of consumer sentiment report for the Federal Reserve to be going into this meeting with.
Diane, you wonder if the uncertainty surrounding these tariffs, the on again, off again, it's a threat one day and it's a concession the next day, is in fact more corrosive than an actual tariff policy. If these were implemented with direction and clarity and communication, would the reaction not be different?
Well, if they're implemented slower and lower, there would be less of an effect. That is not what's happening. And I think that's important. Yes, that's adding to the uncertainty, the rate which, things change by the hour sometimes. And that is important. We've been working with our tax and customs people a lot at KPMG to make sure we're getting all of the information right and how we translate them for our models. And it is sort of mind-boggling. I joked with one of my colleagues. He said, well, we update this daily. I said, not hourly on the chart. But I think it's important, I can laugh about it. This is sort of gallows humor at this point in time because the uncertainty is real. Every C-suite I talk to, you hear it among executives. They don't know where to place their bets. And that's really important. And it's showing up like we saw in this index across the economy. That is something that its own weight. But the tariffs themselves are very large and very real. And I think we have to also acknowledge that. And they're much more broader in scope against this backdrop of, the embers of inflation still smoldering, longer supply chains. Our trading partners are willing to retaliate rapidly, and they want to hit with the most political and economic pain. With longer supply chains, there's a lot more pinch points. This is really something very difficult and a challenge for the Federal Reserve to have to manage through right now.
Well, and as you were just saying, Diane, a challenge for corporate America as well. I do wonder what you're hearing from executives about their confidence in their ability to exercise pricing power, to actually pass on any higher input costs. Because if they can't do that, that could mean, A, that demand is down on the part of the consumer engine, which could lead more toward recessionary calls, I guess, but also that you could be heading into a kind of earnings recession environment if their profitability takes a hit.
Well, really, the size of what we're talking about and what's going to come on April 2nd and April 20th as well, it is both margin compression and they have to pass some on in terms of prices. And so that's why you get that stagflationary aspect of it. And that is what we're hearing, is that we can't pass all of this on. It's too big to pass on. And I think, some of it will go on. That's inflationary. Some of it will hit margins. That's stagflationary. That's why we have a forecast of a very mild bout of stagflation, but that keeps the Fed on the sidelines a lot longer.
Is there a thought on the street, Diane, and among the executives you're talking to, who you refer to here, that this is not the same Donald Trump we saw in the first term when it comes to the markets, that this president who was obsessed on a daily basis with what the S&P 500 was up to is not the man in the Oval Office any longer? Do you believe that?
Well, there certainly is a lot of shock that I'm seeing and a lot of uncertainty. And this is not what they expected in November. This is not what they thought. That said, this is what we've got right now. And I think that's important. and they're trying to manage through it. And there's, this is happening at a time when we've also had a multi-decade erosion in trust. And, when you're trying to get through a bout of uncertainty, we know in economics and in human behavior, having trust is paramount. And we've lost both. And what I also spend a lot of time talking with the C-suite about is that even since before the pandemic, the deterioration in trust among the public and large firms has deteriorated quite rapidly as well. And so this is really important when you're in this period of uncertainty, because it adds to a vicious cycle on top of other policies that could be damaging to the economy.
All right, Diane Swonk, thank you so much, Chief Economist at KPMG. Much appreciated. And Joe, of course, it's interesting to hear from Diane on the economic reality here, knowing President Trump keeps saying, yes, he does expect some disruption, but short-term pain for long-term gain. We don't seem as confident on the kind of long-term
That was
gain
really
idea.
interesting to hear. A pretty honest take there from Diane Swonk, bring you inside the C-suite with what is really being talked about right now. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to look ahead to tonight's SpaceX launch. Yeah, if successful, will be a major step in bringing home marooned astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams. 9 months now at the International Space Station. We'll have details on the mission coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. Thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. After SpaceX and NASA delayed the launch of a new crew to the International Space Station, the mission has been rescheduled for tonight, 7:03 p.m. Eastern Time. You know you're going to see it and hear it on Bloomberg. The launch would pave the way for astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams to at last return home. They've been there, Kaylee, for over 9 months, even though they had only planned for a few days. We've got a live view there on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube inside the cabin as we wait for liftoff here. Kaylee, another example of Elon Musk standing in front of a massive story that we're following.
Oh, absolutely. A story that has become politically charged, as Elon Musk has suggested the previous administration left Wilmore and Williams stranded up there after their Boeing Starliner, of course, that took them to the space station was seen not as fit to bring them home, which is why a SpaceX Dragon 9 is now heading with their relief crew, essentially. This will be Crew 10, relieving Crew 9 on the International Space Station, comprised of 2 Americans, a Japanese astronaut, and a Russian cosmonaut. And again, this is scheduled to lift off just about an hour and 30 minutes from now after being scrubbed earlier this week.
That's right. We had to wait a couple days, but it looks like the weather is good, Kaylee, and you'll be bringing this launch to us right here live on Bloomberg.
Indeed. But first, we got to finish out Balance of Power. We got to talk about Russia and Ukraine as President Trump talks about good discussions with Vladimir Putin. We'll have more ahead with former Ambassador James Jeffrey on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, sat down with our colleague Annmarie Hordern this morning, fresh off of his meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office yesterday. She began by asking him whether he had any concerns about the U.S. leaving NATO.
He was absolutely clear. There was no room for doubt there. And he did, by the way, state the same when he was meeting with Macron, the French president, and with Starmer, the British Prime Minister, 2 weeks before. So I tell some of my European colleagues when they say, well, is the US still connected and committed to NATO? I tell them you might want to turn on your television and listen to the president when he says this. Because he was on the record, and again yesterday, stating this. So I have no doubt, and there is no reason to doubt that.
Did you see Elon Musk yesterday? Were there any individuals at this table that you had to convince for the reasons why the U.S. should be a part of the alliance?
Well, Elon was not there, but in the conversation there was nobody there doubting the need for alliance. But, of course, everybody very much pushing for more spending, and particularly on the European side, because we are lacking behind, but luckily we are now ramping up, and we're spending much more on the European side of NATO. Look what is happening now in Germany. This is staggering, potentially €500 billion euros/dollars extra on defense spending. That's historic.
So the Germans have reached this morning reporting out of Germany on this debt package. As you say, there's going to be a lot more money coming out of Germany for defense.
It looked positive, I think. They had to deal with the Greens, but it seems that they're getting there.
Yeah, it seems like they're getting there, and there will be an agreement in place. There is a debate, though, when it comes to Europe, or whether or not Trump is helpful because of things like this. The Germans are finally starting to spend on things like defense, not having to outsource it to the United States. Or is Trump unhelpful because he really is shaking up the global order, not just when it comes to militarily, but also things like tariffs. Yesterday, 200% on European wine, champagne, and cheeses. How do you view his impact on the continent?
I think when it comes to defense spending, he is extremely helpful. And I told him yesterday, Trump 45, again, his first term. We had pledged in 2014 to go to the famous 2%. Nothing happened. He came in 16, 17. And then immediately you see the defense spending coming up. Now the aggregate amount is about 700 billion, going into 1 trillion extra. That was Trump 45. Now the second Trump presidency, he is only in his 50th days now, I think, or 51st day. We have seen 800 billion from the Europeans. We have seen this half-trillion package from the Germans, but also the Brits, the Swedes, the Czechs, the Belgians, so many others ramping up. And this is because they sense that with Trump in the White House, this is necessary, but also, of course, because we all realize in Europe and here in the US that Russia and China pose a threat. And that we have to rearm ourselves because they are doing this at an incredible pace.
But on trade, he definitely is ratcheting up the tension when it comes to trade policy, tariffs with the European Union. Does that send the wrong message to NATO adversaries?
Well, I would leave that to the EU and the US, but when I look at from an alliance point of perspective, I would argue that Europeans are buying 4 times more when it comes to defense industrial products here in the US than the US is spending in Europe.
You can find Bloomberg's full conversation with Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, online or on the terminal. As the Trump administration continues to pressure our European counterparts to do more for Ukraine following Russia's invasion, the president, of course, is also working for a ceasefire agreement in the war. For the latest on this and where we might be headed, we turn to James Jeffrey, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Mr. Ambassador, it's always great to have you on Bloomberg and hope that you've been well. I wonder what your thoughts are on the language that we're hearing from Vladimir Putin, conditions coming from Moscow that would clearly be unacceptable for Kyiv, and a president of Russia here that appears to be in no hurry to reach a truce or a ceasefire. What do you think we'll hear next from Vladimir Putin?
Thanks for having me on. I've dealt with Putin in both the Bush and Trump administrations, and my short answer is it's too early to tell, but none of this is unexpected, either with Putin or any other adversary or competitor that we're negotiating with. They announced their, for domestic consumption, their maximalist positions, and then we put ours on the table and we go back and forth. What's important here is that now the U.S., Zelensky and the Ukrainians and the Europeans and NATO are all united, as we just heard from Secretary General Rutte, on presenting a common position to Russia. It's up to Russia now. The ball, as Secretary Rubio said, is in their court.
Well, on that point, Ambassador, earlier today we spoke with Kay Bailey Hutchison, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, and asked her specifically about Vladimir Putin and whether or not he is a credible negotiator in this, how seriously the U.S. should be taking his words during this process. This is what she told us.
We can take him seriously, but we're dealing with a despot. We're dealing with a person that we're going to have to play hardball with, along with Ukraine and all of our European allies. And absolutely, we should take him seriously, and we should start playing hardball with him.
Ambassador, are you seeing hardball being played yet?
I am. First of all, it's good to see Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison. We work very well together, pushing back against Russia in Syria, for example, in the last administration, the first Trump administration. I would say that we certainly saw a hardball against the Russians on Trump's part when he ordered the destruction of a whole Wagner battalion crossing the Euphrates in 2018. are striking twice on Russian ally Assad's nuclear weapons and other capabilities to stop, rather chemical weapons, to stop chemical weapons use against his own people. We saw him imposing sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 gas line to Europe. So I think Trump can be tough. He has reinstated all of our weapons and our intelligence to Ukraine. They're keeping Ukraine in the fight. They will continue to keep Ukraine in the fight. If Putin doesn't want to have a ceasefire, then he's going to have to face a Ukraine that will continue to be supported even more strongly, as Secretary General Rutte just said, by the Europeans and by America.
Ambassador, you made the point you've worked with Vladimir Putin and with Donald Trump on some very difficult issues, and so you might have a unique perspective on what Donald Trump posted on social media. He wrote, "At this very moment, in all caps, thousands of Ukrainian troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military and in a very bad and vulnerable position." He writes that he strongly requested to President Putin that their lives be spared. It almost sounds like something Putin could have written himself. What do you make of the strategy in going public with this?
You get a lot of stray electrons from Donald Trump. What he's referring to is the Ukrainian forces in Kursk, that piece of Russian territory that the Ukrainians took last summer. They're being pushed back. That's not essential. It would be good as a bargaining chip. The key is the Ukrainian lines inside Ukraine. They have been holding now pretty much for the last 6 months. I think they will continue to hold.
Ambassador, while we have you, given your experience in Iraq and Turkey, I want to ask you about other negotiations still at play right now between Israel and Hamas, which coincidentally some of the same characters are involved in, including the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff. Our understanding is Hamas made an offer today to release all of the remaining American hostages, including one who is still alive. But it was described by mediators, including Steve Witkoff, as them claiming flexibility publicly while privately making demands that are entirely impractical without a permanent ceasefire. How hopeful are you for forward progress on this front?
Well, we already have forward progress because, again, thanks to the Trump administration and specifically Steve Witkoff, who has the lead in both negotiations, we've pushed not only Hamas but the Israelis to set up the initial ceasefire and the return of some 30-plus hostages, but also the continuation of the ceasefire on a step-by-step basis. Now, Witkoff is right. Hamas is not dealing, big surprise, in a fair and honest way with us and with the Israelis. But the point is, again, Trump and his people, Witkoff in both cases, are leading this. And we're not relying on the Ukrainians in the one case or Israel in the other. And that's normal. Since Harry Truman and Eisenhower in Korea in the early 1950s, in the end, if we're involved in a conflict, even in a supporting role, we have to play a very central role. And allies and partners don't like it, but they live with it because without us, they're, as President Trump said, don't have many cards to play.
So if we don't see a phase 2, when will we see the next chapter in this saga, Ambassador? Is it time for a new structure?
No, the structure we can toy with. Is it a 3-phase or a 4-phase or 1.5 phases? Those are diplomatic niceties. And, you know, the number of hostages released for the number of Palestinian terrorists usually released from Israeli prisons. Those are less important than the core of what's holding this up. That is a discussion that was inherent in the whole structure back in May when President Biden announced it, of Israel and Hamas through indirect negotiations deciding on the fate of Hamas in Gaza and the future of Gaza. Israel's position is, we've defeated you. You can never govern or risk our country again out of Gaza. Hamas doesn't want to accept those conditions. So that's the basic issue that's behind everything here. And that may be hard to solve without a further round of fighting.
All right, James Jeffrey, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey and chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, the Senate advances the Republican-backed spending bill with Minority Leader Chuck Schumer's support. We'll have what's next in this process and for Schumer after the About Face with our signature political panel. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Is it time for new leadership in the Senate?
Next question.
Have you lost confidence in him, the fact that you guys see this so differently?
Next question.
That was House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries when asked about Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and his decision to ultimately support the Republican-backed continuing resolution, which is on track to help avoid a government shutdown come midnight tonight. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio are our closers, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, who's Stone Court Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, Democratic analyst and political science professor at Iona University. So, Jeannie, as the Democrat and the one representing New York specifically here, Chuck Schumer is facing a lot of backlash for his decision to first say we will not support this CR, then to pivot and provide the votes necessary along with a few of his colleagues in the Senate. Did he make the wrong call here? Or did he just go about making the call in the wrong way?
The latter. And Kaylee, you said it exactly right. His call is on point. This was not the strategy that they should have followed to try to shut the government down. But the way he did it was absolutely problematic. And that's what I think we are feeling. Number one, people feel like he misled them. There's nothing worse for leadership than that agonizing should I or shouldn't I in public. He needs to be definitive, and he was not. But the call was correct, and it was a painful call for Schumer, and I'm certain for the other Democrats who went along. But there is no way, when your raison d'etre is to keep the government funded and active and energetic, that you then can become the party of the shutdown. And Chuck Schumer knows that, but the way he went about it was painful to watch.
Rick, you know the Senate better than most people, having worked there the years that you did. It's not the House. And I wonder what you make of this about face. You know what it's like to sit in a member's office waiting for direction from leadership. Democrats are outraged. They're using words I can't use on the air here to describe this. What does this mean for Chuck Schumer?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty big mistake he made to get out there saying, hey, we're going to take this down and we're not going to be for it. And, you know, he enumerated why. And at the time, you had to believe he was going to stick to his guns because it was Sherman-esque, right? We're not going to vote for this bill. And then you start thinking through, like, well, what's the construct then? What's the outcome? I mean, you're going to shut the government down with you can't vote for this bill. So what bill are you going to vote for? Because, by the way, what you get out of the House again is going to be worse than this. I mean, because they now have a tiger by the tail, right? They're going to just make it compounded in a worse way. So I really don't know how he made the first decision, right? That was the critical error. He should have always been for this bill to pass, because the last thing you ever want to do is go to war with a bill that, in essence, outside of like $1 billion cut for the D.C. government, you know, Joe Biden signed earlier at the end of his administration. So, you know, like, how are you going to last through that argument? It just made no sense whatsoever. Who was advising him? What was his strategy? It's not clear, but this may be the greatest classic 24-hour flip-flop ever done by a political leader.
Well, that's pretty impressive considering all the flip-flops we've been seeing lately. But, Rick, when we consider the notion that we had many discussions leading up to this, that this was a different time for Democrats and that they are so upset over the Trump administration, the Department of Government Efficiency, and the efforts that they were just not going to be as willing to play ball on things to come, like the debt ceiling fight. Does this suggest that actually, when push comes to shove, Democrats are still going to show up for those critical votes that Wall Street very much needs to make sure that they take?
You know, it's hard to tell because, you know, when you look at the macro environment around this, you know, they're leaning into cutting government. I mean, like, the whole debate has been DOGE and letting people go and having them kicked out of their offices. And then they are going to be responsible for doing it on a government-wide basis. I mean, that just exacerbates the, like, are you completely tone deaf? I mean, so, yes, do I think the Democrats are going to try and get their act together and be a good opposition to the Trump administration? I'd say there's no clear evidence that that's going to happen yet.
Well, it's interesting. You just mentioned the DOGE and a couple of factors that are running into each other here that are upsetting Democrats. You can see the signs, Rick, when you drive through Washington, D.C. There are protests set up in front of a lot of federal agencies here concerned about the cost cutting, the layoffs, and so forth. And we've been hearing a lot of stories about confrontational congressional town halls being held around the country. This one went viral. Republican Congressman Chuck Edwards of North Carolina, boy, did he get a face full at an event last night in Nashville. Here's a little taste for you.
I have supported, even as a state senator, the fact that we should abolish the U.S. Department of Education. The decisions need to be made. So first of all, there have been no cuts to the staff at VA as of this point. And you certainly will have the right in the next election to cast your vote based off of what you hear coming from me now. Like him or not, Elon Musk has brought a lot of really smart people to Doge. I was proud to vote recently for the House budget resolution, which provides the framework And you wonder why folks don't want to do these town halls.
Well, it's just painful, Jeannie. I don't know what to make of this. The gentleman from Asheville clearly did not have a very good time. Was that a room full of Democrats?
No, that was a room full of constituents. And this is so telling because, number one, Republicans have overestimated how popular they think Elon Musk is. The polls tell a completely different story. And that's why at the Democratic retreat last weekend, the commercials that Democrats have already made and are planning to use are all about these Doge cuts and Elon Musk. The reality is they, too, want an effective and efficient government. What they don't want to do is go as far as Project 2025, which is what is happening with these Doge cuts. And that's why Donald Trump, who's a good reader of the polls, ran away from Project 2025 in the campaign and now has put in Elon Musk to bring it to life with all of these cuts. And, you know, God bless Representative Edwards. He went out there and gave it the good old college try. But this is what Republicans are facing in their districts with constituents on the ground who are watching them destroy popular programs. And by the way, with the budget, more to come. What's happening with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid? Elon Musk says it's a Ponzi scheme, wants to cut it. The president says maybe, maybe not. That's not going to be a popular way for them to go.
So what's the answer for Republicans, Rick? Create some distance between yourselves and Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, or some distance between yourselves and your constituents by not doing town halls?
Yeah, I know I'm going to be contrarian, but it's not about Elon Musk. I mean, when you look at the Consumer Sentiment Index, which I feel compelled to talk about
today,
as much
Rick
as
Davis.
I can, 10.5% reduction from February numbers. Yeah. It's across the board. It's Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. And that is very unusual. The index has really started to bifurcate along party lines. Not this time. People are upset. Republicans are upset. Independents are upset. And Democrats are upset. And they're upset about all the things that, you know, just were shown on that pretty horrific town hall. And even if it's Democrats, I think it represents an anxiety about where this administration's headed on the economy especially, but also on these cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Nobody's believing the rhetoric. They believe what they're seeing, which is people going after those programs and putting them into budgets, saying $850 billion has got to come out of the Medicaid program to fund those tax cuts.
Yet we sit here celebrating the fact that the government won't shut down tonight. At least that appears to be the case. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you, as always, our signature panel with perfect analysis on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll have a final look ahead to tonight's SpaceX launch. We're just about an hour away. We'll have that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. As we count down now, just after 7 p.m., a little more than an hour from now, an important SpaceX launch. We carry all the launches here. Kaylee, there's a live view if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube. This one is important, not just to be testing the vehicle here, Kaylee, but also, I won't use the word rescue, but bringing 2 astronauts home who've been in space for some 9 months, even though they thought they were going for a few days.
Yep, Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams will be making the trip home, assuming all goes according to plan this evening, as their relief crew, 4 astronauts, get set to head to the International Space Station to relieve Crew 9. This will be Crew 10 that is on board this Falcon 9 Dragon. Again, 7:03 is the slated launch time in Cape Canaveral, Florida. We'll be keeping a close eye on this one, and I'll have more coverage of this with Keith Cowing, former NASA employee and editor of NASA Watch, later on, and we'll get reaction from Chad Anderson of Space Capital as well.
In Kaylee, we trust. We'll all be watching. This is going to be something to see. And you can check out a lot more in the Washington Edition newsletter. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.